During the early hours of September 1st, 1969, a small group of junior, low-ranking army officers staged a coup d'etat, ousting the king and setting up Libya's first military rule. At the head of the new regime was the 27-year-old officer, Muammar Gaddafi, who spoke of greater freedom, stronger affinity to the pan-Arab movement, and more social justice for all. The whole country became engulfed in political and social turmoil and revolutionary rhetoric, while the population grew wary and uncertain about the future. Power was being concentrated in the hands of the Gaddafi junta. Purges within the armed forces and among the intelligentsia became familiar occurrences. Opposition of all types was being gradually but effectively silenced and eradicated, and with the constitution abolished, the seeds of dictatorship were being systematically sown in the country. In April of 1973, Gaddafi launched a second revolution. All laws were abolished, political activity curtailed, and those branded enemies of the regime ostracized. A new phase of repression had begun. Books were burnt in the street. Newspapers were banned. Technocrats, students, and professionals were purged, and mass arrests of political activists were organized. Opposition of all kinds had become officially illegal. And that had proved to be only the beginning. There was more to come. Gaddafi embarked on a cultural revolution, which was to introduce sweeping political, economic, and social change in Libya, based on a third universal theory and a green book. The country was moving closer towards totalitarian rule than ever before. Within the economy, extravagant and ill-conceived schemes and projects were approved, and public spending was getting out of control. The military was one of the biggest areas for seemingly limitless spending. From the Soviet Union alone, the Gaddafi regime was to procure arms and military hardware costing over 12 billion US dollars. Military hardware of every description was piled up in Libya. It was only later on that it had become clear why Gaddafi wanted that huge arsenal of weapons and war machine. It was at that time that Gaddafi was contemplating a number of schemes for military expansion into the Arab world and Africa. Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Lebanon were among Gaddafi's first victims for military adventurism. Uganda, the Western Sahara, the Philippines, Nicaragua, and many others were to follow. No country, east or west, was safe from Gaddafi's subversion and military interference. The most senseless and widely condemned of Gaddafi's adventures has been his aggression against Libya's southern neighbor, Chad. For over 10 years, Gaddafi has turned this peaceful but famine-stricken country into a battleground full of death and destruction. Thousands of Libyan and Chadian lives have been lost in vain. The cumulative effect of the regime's political repression, economic disasters, and foolhardy military adventurism has led to deep frustration, resentment, and anger amongst an increasingly restless population. These feelings were expressed in many forms of dissent and opposition: student uprisings, attempted coups, and various other forms of unrest. In fact, as early as Gaddafi's first year in power, a major takeover attempt was led by Lieutenant Colonel Adam al-Hawaz, the then Minister of Defense, and Lieutenant Colonel Musa Ahmed, the then Minister of Interior. More attempts followed in 1970 and 1971. In 1975, a major attempt was organized by one of Gaddafi's own collaborators in the September '69 coup. Major Omar al-Mheshi. During the period from 1975 to 1977, the country saw its worst nationwide student disturbances. As a result, for the first time in its contemporary history, Libya witnessed a series of public executions which included 22 army officers and 3 civilians, 2 of whom were university students. Political opposition grew and began to take a more organized form inside and outside the country. The abolition in 1977 of state structure and private ownership and trade a year later, and the rise of the notorious revolutionary committees have at last revealed the truly totalitarian and repressive character of the regime. The year 1979 saw the emergence of organized opposition. A number of groups were organized in various parts of the world, asserting their determination to challenge the regime and work for its overthrow. A year later, a number of prominent Libyan figures declared their break from the regime and their defection to the ranks of opposition. Amongst them were Dr. Muhammad Yusuf al-Mgariyef, former Accountant General and former Libyan ambassador to India, in July 1980. Abdessalam Ali Aila, diplomat and former chargé d'affaires at the Libyan embassy in India, in December 1980. Ahmed Ibrahim Ahwas, ex-army officer and diplomat and former chargé d'affaires at the Libyan embassy in Guyana, in February 1981. Ibrahim Sahad, ex-army officer and diplomat and former chargé d'affaires at the Libyan embassy in Argentina, in August 1981. Gaddafi responded by sending more hit squads to hunt down Libyan dissidents in several countries. The year 1980 saw the murdering in cold blood of 11 Libyan dissidents, including a journalist and a lawyer in London, a diplomat in West Germany, several businessmen in Italy, and a worker in Greece. Political assassination became official government policy, and the killings were openly admitted by Gaddafi's revolutionary committees. More killings and attempted killings of dissidents were to follow. A number of prominent opposition leaders became targets of Gaddafi's hitmen. Dr. Muhammad al-Mgariyef, Secretary General of the NFSL, Abdelhamid al-Bakkouch, former Libyan Prime Minister, Izzeddin al-Ghadamsi, former Libyan Ambassador to Austria, and several others were on the hit list. Even children did not escape Gaddafi's murderous squads. Karim Qsuda and his sister Suad were the target of an attempt to poison them and their parents in Portsmouth, England. They were fortunate to survive. However, the liquidation campaign backfired, and Gaddafi's practices had become the most blatant manifestation of state-sponsored terrorism. The Libyan opposition gained more sympathy and support both inside and outside the country, and from then on, its activities gathered more momentum. Despite the killing and the terror, more dissident voices were being heard. Gaddafi's terrorism and subversion spread beyond the Libyan dissident opposition. Gaddafi was emerging as a major sponsor of international terrorism. Carlos the Jackal, Edwin Wilson the Merchant of Death, Frank Turple, international terrorist par excellence, Abu Nidal, to mention but a few, were among the notorious characters Gaddafi supported. The Italian Red Brigade, the German Baader Meinhof, the Armenian Army, the IRA, the Basque Revolutionaries, the Japanese Red Army are some of the groups Gaddafi trained, financed, and supported. Gaddafi had deservedly earned the title Godfather of International Terrorism. Worldwide outrage and condemnation of Gaddafi's state-sponsored terrorism followed. The Libyan national opposition had to play its role in exposing the Gaddafi menace and isolating the terrorist regime. Immense human and material resources and organization were urgently needed to carry out this task. In October of 1981, the formation of the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, headed by Dr. Mohammed Yusuf al-Mgariyef, was announced. The front set out to mobilize all Libyan national forces and resources for the service of the national cause and to overthrow the terrorist Gaddafi regime. The front called for the establishment of a constitutional, democratic national government in Libya. The front undertook to carry out a full and comprehensive political program. Books, leaflets, press releases, and newsletters were published in Arabic and other languages. These were devoted to exposing Gaddafi's tyranny, motivating the Libyan masses, and presenting the Libyan national cause to the world. The front had set up daily radio broadcasts beamed to Libya, providing news and information and inciting the population against the regime. Through literature, art, folklore, and various media programs, the front has been able to revive and preserve the rich cultural national traditions and values which Gaddafi had consistently tried to distort and obliterate. Soon, every Libyan home was made aware of the front and its activities. The regime, its security forces, and the revolutionary committees began to see the threat the front represented. The front's political activities were also intensified. Delegations were sent to several Arab and African countries to explain the Libyan case and seek support for the anti-Gaddafi struggle. Contacts were made with various international bodies and human rights groups. Reports, petitions, and memoranda were regularly prepared and dispatched to international conferences, summits, and meetings all over the world. Dr. Mohammed al-Mgariyef, the Front's Secretary General, was personally received by a number of Arab and African heads of state. Protests and demonstrations, such as the one in April of 1984 in front of the Libyan embassy in London, were organized on several occasions in various parts of the world and proved to be very effective. Military action against Gaddafi's regime, a real option of the Front's program, has always assumed top priority. Ahmed Ahwas, the Front's military officer, organized a wide-ranging program of recruitment and training and set up the Front's military wing, the Salvation Corps. It took 2 years of training, planning, and preparation before a major operation got underway in early 1984. Contacts were made with Front members inside the country, and members of the Salvation Corps were sent secretly back home to launch a campaign of military action to destabilize the regime and ultimately to bring about its downfall. Ahmed Ahwas himself, accompanied by 2 of his men, entered Libya on May 6th of 1984. On the way to Tripoli, and a few kilometers away from the Tunisian border, they clashed with a security unit. There was shooting, and Ahwas was killed. A leader in the true sense of the word, Ahmed Ahwas was the Front's first martyr in the battlefield. days later, units of the Salvation Corps staged a brave attack on Gaddafi's headquarters at Bab el-Azizia on the outskirts of Tripoli. The attack marked a turning point in the front's struggle against Gaddafi's regime. It destroyed the regime's invincibility and exposed its weaknesses. Gaddafi hit back with absolute brutality. Thousands of citizens were rounded up. Self-styled arbitrary revolutionary courts were set up all over the country, passing arbitrary sentences and ordering summary executions. These events strengthened people's resolve and resistance to the regime. Gaddafi felt more threatened and insecure. Gaddafi's reign of terror continued unabated. During 1987, 2 Libyan dissidents were gunned down in Athens and Rome, while 9 others were executed publicly in Benghazi. In January of 1985, the Front held the Second National Congress, attended by over 150 delegates. Representatives of Libyan opposition groups and Arab political organizations were also present. Salim al-Hassi and Kamal al-Shami, who took part in the May attack on Gaddafi's Tripoli headquarters, were the focus of attention during the Congress. The Congress outlined the Front's plans for the post-Gaddafi period. State laws would be restored and a fair judicial system set up. Freedom and human rights would be respected and protected by a national constitution. A national assembly would be elected